If you could tell me your general impressions of the quality and usefulness of the intelligence to the administration.
Well, I'll start a little earlier when I was Secretary of Treasury. And our grain markets were opened up for the Soviet Union to buy grain. And they did it at first in a way that we couldn't tolerate. So we changed that. But we wanted to understand the Soviet crops. And there wasn't much information from them. So I went to the CIA and said, here's the problem. We have to get information about what the crops look like at the beginning and as the year goes through, how it's working. And they did a brilliant job with photography. And I found after a while that the Soviets were asking me about their crops because the CIA did a better job than they could do. So by the time I was Secretary of State, I had expectations about what the CIA could do. And I had served on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board at the time that Ed Land and Brooks, I think, was there. And so the photography had been developed then, and you could see the kind of photography that you could take that was astonishing. I found that the documents that came my way were disappointing. But I would say to Bob Gates, Bob, you just put out this estimate on something, Soviet. How about coming over here and bring a few of your analysts and let's talk about it. Then I really learned. That is, the people came and talked, and you got a sense of the nuances and where the points of judgment were and so on. And I found that very, very valuable, and I learned a lot. I did find, and this is a refrain of this conference, it's what the tear down this wall was a metaphor with. Ronald Reagan believed, and I believed, that the Soviet Union could change. When Ronald Reagan said, tear down this wall, he was saying, this looks immutable, but it isn't. It can go down. And there was a huge mindset, and I think it was very much present in the intelligence agency that the Soviet Union wouldn't change. And that was a critical battle all the way through. When it came to the INF Treaty, which we negotiated, that Ronald Reagan was very proud of, got rid of a whole class of nuclear weapons. And of course, we couldn't have really gotten that without the terrific participation of intelligence people and an understanding through them of how you would verify. Ronald Reagan kept saying, trust but verify. So that was good, but then when you got verification, you had to have some confidence that you knew how to do it. And there were experts that knew that, and they were really very, very good. On the other hand, there was this sense that change wasn't possible. Now, this was not the CIA, but it represented the mindset. And the INF Treaty was up for ratification. This is 1988, it's for ratification. Former President Nixon, former Secretary of State Kissinger, and former National Security Advisor Scowcroft wrote a joint article in Time magazine saying the Soviet Union can't change, you're being naive. They're talking about President Reagan and me, and this treaty should be defeated. Well, they couldn't have been more wrong. So there was a mindset. And I think one of the things that I learned from this is that you need to have, and I think the CIA more and more does this, you need to have a constant challenge. You need to have a sort of built-in red team that is almost instructed to take a different point of view and see what they can do with it, and keep challenging basic assumptions, because assumptions wind up coloring your material. Bill Casey was a friend of mine. Going back to when I was Secretary of Treasury, he was SEC Commissioner. Mm-hmm. But Bill had a huge agenda in his mind, a policy agenda. And the result of that was, for me, that I was always uneasy about the intelligence it had produced. Even when I agreed with his agenda, sometimes when I didn't agree with his agenda, and even more so. And I contrasted that with back when I was Secretary of Treasury, the head of the CIA was a man named Dick Helms, who was a wonderful man. I got to know him very well. But we would have a National Security Council meeting. It would start with the President calling on Dick to give his intelligence and answer questions, which he did. Then when it was through, he'd thank him, and he would get up and leave the room. He would not be present when policy was being discussed, because he was being very careful that his job was intelligence, not policy. And if he got over into policy, it was bound to prejudice his intelligence. So that's a long way around the horn with your question.
It's interesting that with the publication of the Reagan diaries, after Bill Casey tragically took ill and, of course, led to his death, that in the search for a successor, President Reagan made it clear that he thought that the cabinet status for the DCI had been a mistake for the reasons that you articulated.
Yes, because the cabinet implies policy.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Sir, if I could ask for your recollections about when CIA and the National Intelligence Council specifically looked at the stresses on Soviet society. You mentioned the economic reporting being pretty good, but when we looked at what was going on in Soviet society...
That reporting on the Soviet grain crop was not pretty good. It was extraordinary. It was just breathtaking. It was so good and really helpful.
Other aspects of the Soviet economy in terms of their foreign trade relationships?
I think there tended to be an overestimation of its strength. Yeah. And it was interesting. It took a book by Harry Rowan, who was well known to, but he researched away and he challenged published a book challenging the assumptions of the strength of the Soviet economy.
Right. And the effects of the downturn of the domestic economy on the society. There was a briefing before Geneva that I don't know if you recall. It was a briefing of the president. You were present. We had Bob Gates was there, Fritz Ehrenmarth, and a CIA analyst named Kay Oliver, who told the story of what was going on with Soviet society. Do you recall the impression that had?
I think they said there was a lot going wrong in Soviet society.
Right.
It was very graphic, and I thought, well, they're getting it right.
Right.
I had been to the Soviet Union quite a lot when I was Secretary of Treasury. And I went, of course, when I was Secretary of State. And so I could see change taking place.
Do you recall, sir, how the president used and considered his daily reporting medium, the president's daily brief? Did that come up in your discussions with him?
Not particularly. It's something that they gave. I got the same briefing that he did. And so I was interested both in what the briefing said, but I also was interested to be sure I knew what the president was being told.
In the National Security Council meetings and the NSPG meetings, when Bill Casey would be there, of course, he would often present on something, but he would also, on occasion, turn to a CIA officer or a national intelligence officer that he brought in to give a detailed briefing. Do you recall how the president was engaged in the discussion and how much he paid attention to?
No, the president paid attention to all of these briefings, and President Reagan believed you had to stick with reality. Don't kid yourself. Know the reality and be strong, and then be ready to engage. Mm-hmm. And he looked to the intelligence, he looked all sources of information that he got to get his construct of the reality as he saw it. Mm-hmm. And of course he saw the weaknesses of the communist system very strongly right from the beginning. He never bought the line mm-hmm. that these people were strong and would never change.
Mr. Secretary, how do you think we did when it came to Soviet leadership issues, what their priorities were, but also the succession? We had to deal with a lot of succession issues in that period after Brezhnev. Well, how would you rate us on those issues?
Well, I don't remember precisely, but the successions happened so fast that whether you predicted it right or not didn't really matter that much. There was a new person. Andropov came very quickly after Brezhnev, then Chernenko. There was always a speculation, and here I think, as I'm vaguely remembering, I thought the intelligence we had was pretty good about this fellow Gorbachev and where is he? And there was an awareness that there was somebody there in the wings.
We've been criticized for some of that reporting. We wrote a paper, Gorbachev, the New Broom, and been criticized in hindsight that we didn't go far enough regarding just how radical, how different a Soviet leader Gorbachev was. Is that your recollection that we missed the mark on that?
I think in general the sort of establishment in the CIA and the Defense Department and maybe even the State Department mm-hmm. had a view, and it was hard to change the view. Yeah. I do remember reading a personal profile of Gorbachev that was put forward sometime after he had taken mm-hmm. office as General Secretary. And I didn't think it was accurate, and I said to the CIA, I said, have you ever met with Gorbachev? He said, no, we have all these things, we've got all this. I said, well, I have met with him quite a few times. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you interview me? I probably logged more time with him than any other American official. But you should pay more attention to human contact.
Sir. And just one more general question. If you could tell us how to do better, based on your experience, to be more on the mark on our assessments. You just mentioned interviewing the people that actually meet with foreign leaders. That's one thing. Is there another idea that we should put into practice?
I have a tremendous respect for the intelligence community, and it has to be clear to anybody who thinks about it at all that this is a vital function. If you look at our problems today. And there are two things that I think can get overlooked if you're not careful. Number one is the importance of readily available information. There's a tendency to think, I got this information and I'm not supposed to have it, but I got it, therefore it must be important. But it may be what is obviously there is more important. So making an effort to not just collect stuff that you collect by non-public means, but look at the public record, look at what's in the newspapers, and look at what's available on the internet, just what anybody can get. And sometimes those are the big picture that tell you the story. So I think that's important. As I said earlier, I think the red team approach is very essential. And having multiple sources, obviously, is important. So you check out. It always seemed to me, I made this comment a number of times to my colleagues in the intelligence, that you're telling us all the time about problems that you see, that you want us to be aware of. Why don't you ever tell us about opportunities that could be taken advantage of? Now, I don't mean policy. I mean, you're looking at a landscape and you see in this landscape, here is a problem, but also here is something that if you work on it could work in your favor. Mm-hmm. And here, I think we got a lot of help, and I can't remember precisely how, but we decided back around, I don't know, 1987 or something like that, that we were going to make a much greater effort with the satellite states and the Warsaw Pact to try to make what life could look like more known to them. And so we tried to find people who could travel and come. And we had tried to get more people to go there. Mm-hmm. And because you could see that under whatever surface of serenity and compliance there was tremendous unease. That was our opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so we wanted to exploit that. We wanted also to understand, and as I remember the evolution in, say, Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, they suddenly sort of dawned on them at the beginning, we better understand who we're trying to communicate with. Mm-hmm. And so then we've had a huge explosion of studies, and you learn that you want to sort of segment the society. It's one thing to be communicating with the elite. It's another thing to be repeating with sort of the mass. It's one thing to, what about women? What about men? What about young people? And try to understand the society, and I think we got a lot of help from. And as I said, I personally found it most helpful to talk to people. And when it was a really important thing, I found if I got whoever was the director, but bring some of the analysts that put this together, and let's talk about it. You learn much more of that than what you can learn by just reading through something.
You found that to be more valuable?
Much more valuable.
I agree. Well, I have found this to be extremely valuable, and I'm sure our viewers will too.
Okay.
I thank you, sir.
Okay. One other thing I think is of tremendous importance, and that is the importance of human intelligence. You get a certain amount by interviewing people who have been there. And I know in those days I was speaking of in the latter part of the 1980s, the people who came out, refugees or whatever, and of course it's always tricky to evaluate what they say, but you get insights from them. But then our own human intelligence, I know how hard it is, and I know there have been assaults on human intelligence that have been unfair and have made it more and more difficult for the agency to mount that. But it's just got to get cleared away. I have felt, and I've said this, but it's all going in the other direction, that the intelligence agency should be a secret agencies. They're not the intelligence advisors to the American people, or to the Congress at large, or to the press. So I believe in the Dick Helms approach. He never gave an interview. Never. I see the director of CIA, I meet the press, I say, what's happened? This is crazy. They should not, they are, of course, full and candid with the designated members of Congress who have oversight responsibilities, and to the administration. That's it. And so I think if that were so, it would be much better, because as soon as you are in the public domain, you become politicized. And as soon as you become politicized, then all of a sudden people are wondering about the nature of your views. So I think the old way, the Dick Helms way, was right. This agency does its work. It has supervision from the president. It has supervision from the Congress. But it's all done on a secret level. And that's the way it should be.